The GPS recalculated twice before I turned it off. I didn't need it. My hands remembered the road even if I wished they didn't. The long curve past the water tower, the railroad crossing that still hadn't been fixed, the way the highway narrowed just before the exit for Millhaven. 14 years. You'd think 14 years would be enough to make a place feel foreign, but the moment the town limits sign came into view, small and sun-faded and missing the screw on its bottom left corner, something in my chest pulled tight the way it always did. Not nostalgia exactly. More like the feeling you get when you hear a song you used to love and you can't quite decide if it still makes you happy or if it just reminds you of something you lost. I drove with both hands on the wheel and my coffee going cold in the cup holder. It was a Thursday in October, and the leaves on the oaks along Fenwick Road had gone the color of old pennies. The morning was quiet. Most of the shops downtown didn't open until 9, and I had pulled into town just after 7:30 because I couldn't sleep. And because I'd learned a long time ago that arriving early meant arriving before the questions started. My father's name was going on a plaque. That was the official reason I was here. 31 years as Millhaven's town clerk, and the County Historical Society had decided to honor him at their annual civic recognition dinner that evening. His name, Thomas Earl Whitmore, would be engraved on a bronze plaque alongside 7 others veterans, educators, a woman who had started the first food pantry in 1987. My father had called me 3 weeks ago, voice careful and measured the way it got when he was asking something he thought I might say no to. "You don't have to come," he'd said, which was his way of asking me to come. "I'll be there," I told him. There was a pause, and then quieter. "Your stepmother's planning the table arrangements." I understood what that meant. Her name was Diane. She had married my father 6 years after my mother passed, when I was already in law school and mostly absent from the house on Birch Street except for holidays that always felt like performances. Diane was not a cruel woman in the way that word usually implies. She wasn't loud about it. She was the kind of woman who said things with a smile that took you a moment to understand were not kindnesses, and by the time you understood it, she was already asking if you wanted more sweet tea. She had decided early on, I don't know exactly when, I only know it had already happened by the first Thanksgiving, that I was the kind of daughter who left, not the kind who got called away, or the kind who had reasons, or the kind who came back, just the kind who left. And she had told Millhaven this story so many times and so consistently that by now the story was the town's own memory. What the town believed, that I had gone to law school in Raleigh, struggled, left before finishing, and eventually found some kind of office job in Washington that I inflated the importance of whenever I came home. What was true? I had graduated top 15% of my class, passed the bar on my first attempt, spent 2 years at a firm in Charlotte, then joined the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia 9 years ago. I had worked public corruption cases. I had worked fraud cases that took 3 years to build and ended in federal convictions. 14 months ago, my team had completed an 18-month investigation into a procurement fraud scheme that had cost the federal government close to $60 million. The lead attorney on that case was my name. I had never corrected the town's story. That might sound like pride, but it wasn't. It was more that by the time I understood the story had taken hold, it had been told so many times that correcting it felt like standing in a river and arguing with the current. And my father, my gentle, conflict-averse father, had never corrected it either. I think he believed that eventually things would sort themselves out. He had been believing that my whole life. I checked into the motel on Route 9 because staying at the house on Birch Street was not something I was willing to do. The woman at the front desk recognized me in the vague way that small towns recognize people, not enough to place the name, just enough to make the eyes narrow slightly in that process of categorization. I got my key and carried my bag to room 114 and sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes looking at the curtains. Then I changed into jeans and a sweater and drove to the diner on Main for breakfast, because some habits are older than the things that make you want to break them. The diner was called Patsy's, which had been its name since before I was born and apparently would be its name until the building itself returned to dust. I took a booth by the window. The waitress, a young woman I didn't recognize, brought coffee without being asked, which reaffirmed something I had always believed about small-town diners. I was on my second cup when I heard my stepmother's voice. She was at the counter with 2 women I recognized from the Methodist Church, Eleanor Marsh, and a woman whose name I could never hold in my head. Something beginning with P. They were having the kind of morning conversation that is really more of a performance for any audience that might be listening. The volume calibrated just enough to carry. "Rachel's in town," Diane was saying. "She said it the way you'd report a minor weather event. Drove up from Washington." "Oh, for Thomas's dinner tonight?" Eleanor said. She's staying at the motel." A pause that did specific work. "She never stays at the house." I've offered. "That's a shame." "Well," a brief sound that was close to a sigh but more practiced. "She's always been independent, I suppose is the word. Thomas is just happy she made the trip. She doesn't come back often. Her work keeps her busy." The way she said work suggested a set of air quotes she was too polished to actually make. I looked out the window at the empty sidewalk. A leaf skittered across the concrete. I drank my coffee and did not turn around and did not say anything. I had learned to do that. Silence was not the same as agreement. I had learned that distinction in a courthouse, and it served me just as well in a diner on Main Street. The recognition dinner was held at the Millhaven Civic Center, a building that had been constructed in 1974 and renovated sometime in the late 90s in ways that hadn't entirely worked out. The parking lot filled up by 6:15. I arrived at 6:20 and sat in my car for a moment in the way I had once sat in the car outside a courthouse before a trial, taking inventory. I was wearing a navy dress, low heels, my hair pulled back. I had brought nothing that needed explaining. The lobby held a reception table and a sign-in sheet, and the particular kind of crowd that forms at civic events in small counties: local officials, longtime residents, people who had known my father for decades and meant it warmly. I signed in and took a name tag and was almost immediately found by my father. He was 71 and had gone fully white-haired in the past few years, which suited him in a way that Gray never had. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent 3 decades doing unglamorous, necessary work without complaint, and was quietly pleased that someone had noticed. When he saw me, he put his hand on my shoulder the way fathers do when they are too reserved for a full embrace but want you to know they are glad you're there. "You look well," he said. "So do you, Dad." Diane picked out my tie. I looked at the tie. It was burgundy with a small pattern of something that might have been oak leaves. "It's a good tie." He smiled in his small way. "She's been organizing for 3 weeks." "I know." He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did I. We walked in together, and people shook his hand, and I stood beside him and smiled and said my name when asked, and watched the expressions that formed when they processed it. Not hostility, not exactly. More the slight recalibration of someone encountering a fact that doesn't match the file they've been keeping. Diane found us at the buffet table. She was wearing a cream blazer and had her hair done in the way she did it for occasions. And when she saw me, she produced her smile the way you produce a document you've prepared in advance. "Rachel." She touched my arm. "So glad you made it." "Of course," I said. "Long drive?" "Not bad." She held the smile for another beat, and then directed her attention to a passing county commissioner, and I picked up a small plate of appetizers and moved toward the edge of the room. Over the next hour, I had the conversation I had been expecting. The questions came from different people, but they were essentially the same question, asked in the various ways that small-town curiosity disguises itself as friendliness. What was I doing now? Still up in Washington? Doing what exactly? Something with the government? Did I like it up there? Was I thinking about coming back? My stepmother, circulating with the practiced ease of someone who had been hosting on behalf of my father for years, added her commentary in pieces, always at a slight distance, the way you add seasoning to something someone else is cooking. She told Eleanor Marsh that I worked in one of the federal offices and that it was very administrative. She told the commissioner that I had always preferred the city to small-town life, which was true enough to be technically accurate and false enough to be an art form. She told a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Pulliam that I had a good head for paperwork, and she said it with such genuine-seeming warmth that Mrs. Pulliam smiled at me afterward like I'd been complimented. I ate my dinner. I talked to people my father had worked with and found them genuinely interesting. I talked to a man who remembered my mother and said so simply and without performance. And that was the best conversation I had all evening. The program began at 7:30. The County Historical Society president, a tall man named Gerald who took the microphone with the air of someone who had been waiting for this moment for some time, spoke about the history of civic service in Millhaven. He read the names of the honorees. He called my father to the stage. My father walked up there with his burgundy tie and his white hair and his careful posture, and he shook hands and held the plaque and looked at it for a moment before looking out at the room. He said a few words. He thanked the county, the society, the people he'd worked with. He said that the work was never about the recognition, but that it was kind to receive it. He looked at Diane. Then, briefly, he looked at me. I nodded once. He nodded back. It was a quiet thing. Nobody in the room would have noticed it. But it was ours, and I kept it. The applause lasted a good while. My father returned to his seat beside Diane, who patted his hand and leaned in to say something that made him smile. I watched from my seat at the back of the room and finished my water and thought that whatever else the evening had been, that moment on the stage was real, and my being here for it was real. And that was enough. The ceremony concluded around 8:15. Gerald thanked everyone, and the room relaxed into the particular noise of a civic event in its aftermath, people pushing chairs back, conversations resuming, the clatter of a catering staff beginning to clear. I stood and was considering whether to say my goodbyes now or in another 15 minutes when I heard someone say my name. Not my first name, my last name, and with a title attached. Counselor Whitmore. I turned. He was a man in his mid-60s, gray-suited, with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms like this and rooms far larger than this. I recognized him in the half-second before he reached me. William Garrett, Federal District Court Judge, Eastern District of North Carolina, appointed 11 years ago, known in the legal community for an uncompromising approach to courtroom procedure and an equally uncompromising respect for attorneys who did their homework. I had appeared before him twice. The second time had been 14 months ago, in the closing stages of the procurement fraud case, when I had argued a suppression motion that he had ruled on after 17 days of deliberation. He had ruled in our favor. We had gone to trial 3 weeks later. He extended his hand. I thought that was you. I didn't realize you had family in Millhaven. My father, I said, and we shook hands. Thomas Whitmore, the town clerk. He looked toward the stage area where my father was still receiving congratulations. Good man. I had no idea. He looked back at me. I'm here for the Hargrove family. George Hargrove's wife was one of the honorees. We go back about 30 years. He said it easily, the way people explain their presence when they want you to know they belong. Then, the filing you submitted in the Caldwell matter last spring, the brief on standing. I've been using it as a reference point for 3 cases since. I said something modest. He waved it off. I mean it as a compliment. It was a clean argument, precise. He said this in the tone of a man who does not give the compliment often, and knows you know it. We talked for a few minutes about the Caldwell matter and about an appellate decision that had come down in September that both of us had opinions about. He was sharp and direct and spoke to me the way he spoke in court, as if your time and his were equally valuable and there was no point in pretending otherwise. I did not look around the room while we talked, but I was aware of it the way you are aware of traffic while walking on a city sidewalk. I was aware that people had noticed. I was aware of the particular quality of attention that forms when a room senses that something unexpected is happening. Millhaven was a small town. Gerald, the society president, was within earshot. Mrs. Pulliam was 3 tables away. Eleanor Marsh was near the dessert table, and Diane was standing near the far wall with my father, and I did not look at her. Gerald materialized at Judge Garrett's elbow within minutes, in the way that people with civic ambitions materialize near federal judges, and the judge introduced me with the same ease with which he had greeted me. Rachel Whitmore, Assistant U.S. Attorney, D.C. One of the sharpest prosecutors I've seen in that court in the last decade. Gerald blinked. It was a small thing, that blink, but it contained multitudes. Thomas's daughter, the judge added, nodding toward my father, and Gerald's face did something complicated and rapid that he covered with a wide smile and an extended hand. I shook it and said something appropriate and did not allow myself to feel the thing I was feeling too visibly, because I had learned that courtrooms and rooms like this one required the same discipline, and displaying too much of what you feel hands your opponent something they didn't earn. My father reached me about 10 minutes later, after the judge had moved on and the room had returned to its normal rhythm. He walked up beside me without ceremony and stood there looking at the room for a moment. Judge Garrett, he said finally. It was not quite a question. We know each other professionally, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Diane told Mrs. Pulliam that you do administrative work. I know. Another silence. My father had a way of saying the important things sideways, arriving at them by a long route rather than directly, and I had spent a lifetime learning to wait for the route to finish. I should have corrected that, he said. A long time ago. I looked at him. His profile, the white hair, the burgundy tie. Yes, I said. You should have. He nodded once. He kept looking at the room. I'm sorry, Rachel. It was quiet enough that no one else could have heard it. It was said without performance, without the addition of reasons or explanations, or the kind of context people add to apologies to dilute them. Just those 3 words, standing by themselves. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't entirely, and we both knew it. I didn't say don't worry about it either. I said, thank you, Dad, which was the true thing, and I meant it, and I think he understood why I chose those words instead of the others. We stood there for another minute, side by side, looking at the room. The catering staff stacked chairs. Gerald spoke to someone near the exit. The lights over the stage had been dimmed. I thought about the drive back to Washington I would make tomorrow morning. The GPS that I would silence 2 exits before Millhaven because I knew the road. The office I would walk back into Monday morning. The case files on my desk. The particular silence of a federal building at 7 a.m. when you are the first one in. I thought about all the years between this room and the first time I had walked out of it, deciding to be something that a town this size didn't have a clear picture of. I had not come here to prove anything. I had come here because my father's name was going on a plaque, and that was real, and I wanted to be present for it. Whatever else the evening had contained, that was still true. Diane did not speak to me again before I left. I saw her once, near the coat room, speaking to Eleanor in a lower voice than she had used that morning at the diner, and she looked up and our eyes met for a moment before she looked away. I did not try to interpret the expression. I had spent enough time in rooms where people did not say what they meant to know that interpretation was frequently a waste of energy. I found my father near the exit and kissed his cheek and told him the plaque was well-deserved, which was true. He held onto my hand a second longer than usual when we said goodbye. I walked to my car alone in the October cold, the parking lot half empty, the security light at the far end humming steadily. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. There was nothing triumphant about what I felt. That was the thing I had expected, or that I think some part of me had come here half expecting some clean, lit-up feeling of vindication, the town's mistake corrected, the record set straight. But what I actually felt was quieter and more complicated, the way most true things are. I felt tired in a way that was not unpleasant. I felt something for my father that was closer to tenderness than anger, which surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. And underneath all of it, something that took me a moment to name: steadiness, like a compass finding north, not because anything dramatic happened, but because that was simply what compasses did. I started the car. The heater came on with a sound I remembered. I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road that ran past the water tower, past the railroad crossing, past the exit sign that would take me back to Route 9 and the motel with its thin curtains and its reliable coffee maker. Tomorrow I would drive back. The case files would be there. The office would be there. The work would be there. The way it always was, demanding and precise and indifferent to anyone's small-town story about who I was and what I could manage. I knew who I was. I had always known. And somewhere in the last few hours, in the way that things that have been waiting a long time sometimes finally settle, I thought my father had come to know it too. That was the thing I held onto on the drive back to the motel. Not the judge's words, not the look on Gerald's face, not Diane's sudden quiet, just my father standing beside me at the edge of that room, saying the hard, true thing without dressing it up. And the fact that when he said it, I believed him.